The writer of Ecclesiastes, a book of the Hebrew scriptures, gave us an immortal line that many of us have probably used before, even if we didn't know where it came from at the time. There is nothing new under the sun. Several Wednesdays ago, feeling a little tired mid-afternoon, I decided to lie down on my couch and have a nap. When I woke up a little bit later, I was stunned to realize that during my brief period of unconsciousness, an angry mob of white supremacists had stormed the Capitol building and taken the chambers of Congress, intent on overturning the results of the national presidential election and Georgia's congressional election, which had happened the previous day. After I quickly disabused myself of the idea that the only thing holding this country together was apparently my continued state of being awake, the second thing I realized that day was how many people wanted to assert that this isn't who we are. And then after that, how fortunate we all are that people immediately pushed back on that idea, saying, yes, though, this is who Americans have always been. There is nothing new under the sun. I am not trying to say that the events of January 6th weren't a next level of shocking and horrifying to many of us. And I realize that all of this might sound a bit like doomsaying in the wake of such a joyous inauguration as we saw. But my goal is not necessarily to try and bring us back into a hopeless place, but to help us look at the patterns that brought us to that near breaking point that we experienced before the inauguration. And even in the undeniable toxicity of that political climate, seeing white men in paramilitary gear, white supremacist tattoos and t-shirts bearing semi-automatic weapons, these things, seeing them in our capital, alienated even some hardline supporters and enablers of the then presidential administration, now thankfully outgone, the head of whom spent this terrifying moment in history cheering on the mob from the safety of the White House. And there are many ways to look at precisely how upsetting January 6th was. I could mention the blatant disinterest of Capitol security and police in stopping the invasion, and how long it took them to respond with seriousness to the fact that there was an ongoing threat. Or I could mention the strategic disabling of the panic buttons in the offices of Black and Latina congresswomen. Or I could talk about those senators and representatives for whom masking for others' safety is an idea so anathema as to put other elected officials in mortal danger from COVID while sheltering from the mob. There is absolutely no way to make these facts go down easily, even weeks after the fact and with a national ceremony of healing just behind us. Each of these facets of January 6th, 2021 would be its own threat and its own atrocity. And we aren't just facing one, we're facing them all at once. Recently, we celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and his words, as always, are evergreen. The prophetic Reverend Dr. King reminded us, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It is up to us in the present to think about how each of these threats to justice aren't isolated, but intertwined, emerging from the same root and forming a pattern. Each year in late January, in the wake of celebrating the life and prophetic work of Reverend Dr. King, our congregations are reminded once again of our own commitment to carry on with his work of racial justice. This harkens back to his 1966 Ware lecture to the General Assembly of the UUA, when he invoked the story of Rip Van Winkle, who fell asleep on a mountainside and then woke up 20 years later, having slept through the American Revolution. And in that speech, Dr. King urged us not to sleep through the revolution. After last Wednesday's inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris, which is for certain a landmark occasion for women and especially women of color, we can be assured that the Trump administration is well and truly over. But the transition of power doesn't mean that the prejudices that swept him into office are gone. More than ever, we need to be real with each other about what this attempted and encouraged and enabled coup d'etat means against the backdrop of a much longer history than any of us can remember in our lifetimes. For those of us like me who are liberal and white, who are inclined to take to social media with dismay and say, this isn't who we are, and who are assuaged by an aesthetically pleasing spectacle of people of many races sharing a stage during the inauguration, it's time to really know, down to our marrow, how much of what's happening is who we are, is part of us. There is nothing new under the sun. What is past is always present, and if we make no move to rectify the mistakes of the past, our future is assured to repeat them. This was actually far from the first attempted white supremacist coup in United States history. In fact, some previous attempts of domestic terrorists motivated by racism to take over state governments weren't stopped, and the attempts succeeded. In late 2019, before any of 2020 even happened, Black journalist and poet Michael Harriot wrote a long series of tweets about post-Civil War history in the South and the emergence of Jim Crow laws. Folks, that Twitter thread taught me more about the history of white-led racial terrorism in the US than years in the Portland, Maine public school system, plus 2 post-secondary degrees. Harriet's Twitter thread taught me that after the end of the Civil War, during the period I know my history books kind of glossed over, but called Reconstruction, Black voters in the southern states were a powerful political coalition that sent 17 congressmen to Washington between 1870 and 1898. In local and state governments in the South, Black representation in the government wasn't something to be reached for as it is today. It was a simple fact. Black people, as is the case today, turned out to exercise their right to vote in massive percentages. And this was helped along by Union troops, many of whom were also Black, stationed in these southern states to enforce federal law. And again, white militias, domestic terrorists, including the Ku Klux Klan, battled these federal troops to attempt to violently oust Black elected officials, sometimes sustaining combat over years at a time. And if they didn't succeed by fighting Union troops directly, they assassinated Black candidates for office and Black voters to undermine and suppress the power of the Black vote and intimidate those who would try to exercise it. This legacy of voter suppression through violent coercion, coupled with blatant voting fraud that favored the party of the white supremacists, led to a dispute over the national presidential election in 1876. And the winner of that election was forced to collude with the party of the white supremacists in order to gain the electoral college victory that would grant him the presidency. Part of that collusion involved the federal government agreeing not to interfere with how southern states treated their Black citizens, which immediately gave rise to Jim Crow laws. I realize that these are a lot of dates. This is a lot of history. And I certainly did not learn any of that in school, but what I did learn about in the year 2000 was the legal suppression of Black voters in southern states that led to George W. Bush's electoral victory. And I learned about it again in 2018 when Stacey Abrams' run for the Georgia governor's seat was stolen by legal suppression of Black and poor voters. It's no coincidence that she too is a Black woman. What is past is always present. In 1874, thousands of white Louisianans overthrew the elected state government in New Orleans, which was then the capital of Louisiana, by outnumbering police. Racist terrorists held the Louisiana State House, the city armory, and downtown New Orleans for 3 days. This was one of the precipitating events that led to the 1876 election's widespread fraud and suppression aimed at tipping the ballot box toward racism and white supremacy. I didn't learn about that in school either, but I did wake up several Wednesdays ago to a mob of white supremacists overrunning the federal Capitol building to limp and reluctant opposition. Because what is past is always present. I want to be clear that I'm not talking about this from a place of more experience or better education than most white folks. Growing up white in New England, I was never taught much of this history, except in the most vague, sugar-coated way. I'm talking to you as someone who wasn't aware of my own complicity in the United States' long history of racism until embarrassingly well into adulthood. And out of a desire to understand our current social ills and how they fit into the bigger picture of an American history that was painted as an ongoing story of progress, I had to deliberately go out of my way to seek this information. Michael Harriot, who in one Twitter thread taught me so much, ended his commentary by saying, "Since the beginning of this country, racist white people have never been on the side of democracy. And these incidents have nothing to do with hate. They are an orchestrated terrorist campaign to keep power. Whether it's voter suppression or mass murder, they have done it before and they are still doing it. The American education system teaches us dates and events, but not how all of this fits together to show the true history and how it repeats itself. It is easy to look at these events and see isolated examples of racism, but when you put them together, not only does a pattern emerge, you realize why they aren't common knowledge. And this, dear friend, is white supremacy. What we saw on January 6th of this new year is not, in fact, new. And nor, I'm sorry to say, is it particularly new in our own tradition of Unitarian Universalism. As a white UU entering seminary, my grasp and knowledge of UU history was mostly relegated to the luminary preachers of the 19th century, such as William Ellery Channing, who essentially defined Unitarian Christianity, and firebrand abolitionist and Universalist Theodore Parker. So it was a shock to hear Reverend Dr. William Sinkford, the first Black president of the UUA, speak frankly to my entering cohort of seminarians about one of the reasons UU attracts very few people of color, the lasting legacy of the Black empowerment controversy. There are few ways to sum up this era of UU history both neatly and honestly, but the long and the short of it, and what I didn't know going into seminary, that I had never heard in my work as a church lay leader and needed to go get a graduate degree to learn, was that in the late 1960s, the influence and power of segregationist UU churches, emboldened by our custom of congregational self-governance, strong-armed the newly formed Unitarian Universalist Association into backing down from supporting Black UUs at the national level by funding a groundbreaking and important anti-racist push to come together as a tradition to desegregate our churches and empower our Black leaders. Yes, it is true, Unitarian Universalists of the past had our own angry mob of racist white people force our faith into betraying people who were and still are part of us, who are an essential and holy part of our work together as human beings. And they did this because, like today, they didn't want to see themselves decentered. They didn't want to be in the company of those they saw as other, those who didn't fit their congregation's milk white culture, those who had immense gifts to offer the future of our faith. And in doing so, they set us back countless decades in the quest for racial equity. 3 years after Reverend Dr. King gave the Ware lecture at our General Assembly, urging us, don't sleep through the revolution, white UUs chose not to listen and heed his prophetic words, and their inaction and inertia became our inheritance. While other less progressive faith traditions forged ahead with courage on this specific front, UUs shrank back from the work our Black siblings were calling us to do. And so, rather than live in a faith that saw them as less than, many of those Black siblings and leaders chose to leave us to our great detriment. Reverend Dr. Sinkford, the first person from whom I learned this history, wrote in a UU World article called The Dream of White Innocence, when our faith withdrew from the racial justice conversation, more than a few people of color withdrew too. Feeling betrayed, we left UUism. I was one of them, but there were many others. I could call some of their names, but you do not know them because they're not here today. They did not find their way back to this faith like I did. And we will never know what this faith might look like or be like today if they could have remained. Our faith looked away. We didn't stay woke. When I first learned this, I was stunned. Many other white seminarians had never heard this history before, but I learned eventually that this was known to many Black UUs and other UUs of color. And for some of them, it had been fundamental information, either in their conscious decision to stay with the faith in hopes of helping it live into its promise, or say goodbye to it for good as yet another institution that would fail to be a haven from the white power structure that threatened them at every turn. And I continue to learn this again and again as we as a people, we as a faith, make mistakes, slip up, fall through, and fight about the real extent of our commitment to live into the dream of Reverend Dr. King, to make low our mountains and raise up and exalt our valleys, to approach each other with humility as equals. The fact is, this largely white faith institution owes a great debt to the people of color who remain with us and who continually call us back into covenant with one another. It is a debt that may never be paid off in our lifetimes. Each year, we have to spend publicly spilling words about why it's important to get our people on board with anti-racism and passing the mic to those who have been denied it is another year we spend, to paraphrase the very famous Langston Hughes poem, deferring the dream. The problem of having a seldom acknowledged history of racism, just as with American schools, just as with American media, is that it shows off an image of ourselves that isn't flattering, or in keeping with our own ideas or beliefs about who we are. Like looking at old senior pictures of ourselves dressed in the couture of whenever it was we graduated from high school. For some of us, it was shoulder pads and intensely sprayed perms. And for some of us, it was, let's say, a goth phase that didn't last past our teens. It is so easy to look at that picture and with some embarrassment, distance ourselves. That's not who I am. Sorry, long ago mall goths and Madonna enthusiasts and regrettable haircut havers. That was who you were then. And there's still some of that past in your present. And this isn't just about your iffy fashion choices. This is about the content of our shared character. On the afternoon of January 6th, when I woke up to hear about the storming of the US Capitol and the Senate chamber, the fabric of this strained, stained, threadbare union was not, in fact, being held together by my ability to remain physically awake, but in a way, it is being held together by our collective wakefulness, our ability to remain awake, to remain present and deeply uncomfortable, to the curdled dream of white innocence and how it poisons and pollutes our motivations, our ability to see and know what's going on around us, and even our understanding of our own history. Both Reverend Doctors whose work I've shared with you today, King, a Christian, and Sinkford, a UU, still with us today, are standing over us speaking from history, while many in our tremendously white faith still obstinately try to sleep through the revolution. And these people are clapping their hands in our ears and refusing to let us rest. Wake up, wake up. What is past is always present, and there is nothing new under the sun. So let us go out with these words, waking us, waking us, waking us again and again, as often as it takes to finally know the power in our own wakefulness. With an understanding of where we come from, finally we have the tools to show us where we might go, where we might run or walk or roll or dance if we can stay awake now. And in that place beyond now, where anguish and witness meet as one, in that place where there is no shame and no embarrassment, but accountability, where there is more love, more joy, more hope, may we be able to rejoice in exactly who we are: expansive, accepting, welcoming, divine, and at long last, free.